Pitcairn Island, it's one of those places that feels like it's at the edge of the world. It's this tiny little volcanic dot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and it's famous, right? Famous for being a kind of tropical paradise founded by the legendary mutineers from the HMS Bounty. But behind that postcard image, there's a story that is so much darker than most people could ever imagine.
It really all comes down to this one number, 55. You see, back in 2004, this was the number of criminal charges that completely shattered Pitcairn's peaceful reputation, forever. And we're not talking about small things. We're talking about dozens of horrific crimes that had been buried, hidden from the rest of the world for generations.
And here's what makes that number so absolutely staggering. Those 55 charges, they were against people living in a community of just 47. Let that sink in. There were more criminal charges than there were people living on the entire island.
So what were the charges? Well, they were for systemic child abuse and rape over many years. 7 men were accused, which was nearly 1/3 of the entire adult male population. And look, these weren't just any residents. The list of the accused included the island's own mayor and its chief magistrate. The very people who were supposed to be upholding the law were right at the heart of it all.
So you have to ask, right? How on earth does something like this happen? How does a place that the world sees as this idyllic little escape become the setting for such a deep, horrifying secret? Well, to get a handle on the crimes of the 21st century, you actually have to go all the way back to the island's violent birth in the 18th century.
Yeah, the story really kicks off not on Pitcairn itself, but on a British naval ship, on a mission that would go down in history. It's the story of probably the most famous mutiny ever and a really desperate escape.
It all starts in 1787. The HMS Bounty leaves Britain, headed for Tahiti. Now you have to remember, life in the Royal Navy back then was brutal and unforgiving. So when the crew gets to Tahiti and spends 5 months there, they discover this world of freedom they couldn't have even dreamed of. So when it was time to leave, they just couldn't go back to their old lives. In 1789, led by Fletcher Christian, they cast their captain, William Bligh, adrift in a tiny boat, took over the ship, and just like that, they were fugitives.
And they weren't just any fugitives. They were running from the British Empire, the biggest naval power on the entire planet. So they needed a place to hide, an island that was uncharted, uninhabited, and so ridiculously remote that no one would ever find them. They were going to try and build their own little paradise, completely beyond the reach of the law.
And in 1790, they found it, Pitcairn Island. But the society they started there? Oh man, it was no paradise. From the very first day, it was a total dystopia, built on a foundation of violence and terrible inequality.
The problem was just baked right in from the start. You had 9 British mutineers who saw themselves as the masters. Each one of them took a Tahitian woman as his partner. But then there were the 6 Tahitian men they brought along who were treated like property, like slaves, and were forced to share the 3 remaining women between them. This was never going to be a peaceful community. It was a powder keg waiting to blow.
This immediate, brutal structure planted what you can only call the seeds of discord. From day one, the entire society was just defined by this simmering resentment. The Tahitian men were denied any kind of equal status, and the women were treated like property to be divided up. Conflict wasn't just likely, it was absolutely inevitable. And that powder keg, it exploded almost right away. One of the mutineers figured out how to distill alcohol, which just threw gasoline on the fire. After one of the women killed herself following a brutal drunken assault, the Tahitian men finally rebelled, killing 5 of the mutineers. But then, in this final, horrifying twist, the Tahitian women, terrified for their own lives, turned on the rebels and murdered every single one of them. It was just absolute carnage.
So after all this murder and suicide, the island's population was just decimated. And out of all that wreckage, one man stepped up to rebuild the entire society, completely in his own image.
Just one. After all that fighting, all that bloodshed, only one of the original 15 adult men was left alive, a mutineer by the name of John Adams. He was now alone with 11 Tahitian women and a bunch of kids. The entire future of the island was now in his hands.
And this is where the great myth of Pitcairn Island was born. See, when an American ship stumbled upon the island in 1808, John Adams sold them this story of a perfect, devout Christian society. But the reality, the hidden truth, was that this place was forged in bloodshed, slavery, and murder. And Adams,
he buried that truth deep.
He basically created a theocracy, with himself as the absolute leader and pastor. He used a Bible from the ship to create and enforce these super strict religious laws. He banned alcohol, which, had caused all the chaos before, and he fathered dozens of children with the surviving women, literally populating the island with his own descendants. He created this powerful, peaceful story that completely erased the island's horrific origins.
And for almost 200 years, that story held up. The world saw Pitcairn as this quaint, religious little curiosity. But the violence of its founding, that never really went away. It was just buried, lying dormant, waiting to erupt again with the 2004 scandal.
Because it's so incredibly isolated, the island's gene pool is, well, tiny. To this day, the huge majority of the population, we're talking around 90%, are the direct descendants of those first mutineers and the Tahitian women they brought with them.
And this is the crucial part. The men who were accused and convicted in those 2004 trials, they weren't outsiders. They were the direct descendants of the very people who founded that violent, unequal society all those centuries ago.
So when we look at these numbers again, they just hit differently, don't they? Out of about 20 men on the island, 7 were charged and 6 were convicted. This was never a case of a few bad apples. This was a systemic, deep-rooted problem in the island's very DNA. And the 2004 scandal wasn't even the end of it. The mayor who was convicted, Steve Christian, was a direct descendant of the mutiny leader Fletcher Christian. His successor, Mike Warren, was also convicted, this time in 2010, for possessing child pornography. You see this disturbing pattern of abuse tied directly to the island's highest office. It wasn't until 2019, when the island elected its first female mayor, that you see the first real glimmer of hope for change.
When you get right down to it, the island's whole culture, the secrecy, the patriarchal power, the sense that they were somehow above the law, you can trace all of it right back to John Adams. He built a society in his own image, and that dark legacy has been echoing down through the generations ever since.
So the horrific crimes that came to light in 2004 weren't some random, terrible event. They were a tragic, modern-day echo of the violence and abuse of power that were baked into the island's foundation from the very beginning. On Pitcairn, the past was never really past at all.
And all of this leaves us with this really profound and unsettling question. Can a society, especially one as tiny and isolated as Pitcairn, ever really break free from the trauma of its own creation? Or are the sins of the fathers doomed to be visited on their sons forever?
Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.